Okay, so one thing that's very clearly covered by the duty of loyalty for all the questions we'll have about does it cover this or that or the other thing, it very clearly bars directors, officers, controlling stockholders from making decisions or entering into transactions on behalf of the corporation solely to benefit themselves rather than to benefit the corporation as a business. So this is a principal concern of the duty of loyalty, and will have various doctrines dealing with this kind of self-dealing. These are corporate transactions or contracts that directly or indirectly implicate the financial interests of corporate insiders. The book describes the evolution of how the law handled self-dealing transactions. The general trend is toward allowing self-dealing transactions. At one point, they were just void. They were not even valid contracts. And at the same time that they are allowed, the law imposes certain additional procedural requirements or scrutinizes them in an especially careful way. In the Hayes case, we'll think through this threshold requirement of disclosure. But here, I want to say a bit about the substantive rules that govern conflict transactions. We'll see there's one approach where a court looks directly at the substantive fairness of the transaction and just decides as a matter of equity, is this fair or not? But there are alternative procedural approaches to handling the transactions, where sometimes the court's going to conclude that thanks to whatever procedural steps have been employed, the court does not need to evaluate the substantive fairness of the deal. So the question is often going to be, okay, look, we have a conflict of interest here. Now, that's not always going to be obvious. That's especially one thing that's tricky here. Just identifying a conflict of interest can be subtle. It can be contested. Think about the conflict of interest that 4 of the 20 directors had in the Cayman versus American Express case. But assume, all right, we've identified a conflict of interest. The immediate consequence of that is that this is a circumstance where we can't just apply the good old business judgment rule. Without changing something, we don't have a disinterested decision maker, the kind that we were so comfortable deferring to under the business judgment rule. So we'll see. The question is, can we synthesize a disinterested decision maker? In other words, can we find some mechanism for obtaining an approval that is, at least in appearance, disinterested, that can generate some comfort about the substantive terms of the transaction without actually asking a court to evaluate those substantive terms directly? So the basic framework, which most states follow, you can see here from Delaware in section 144A. This directly covers conflict transactions. No contract or transaction between, on the one hand, a corporation, and on the other hand, one or more of its directors or officers. Okay, so, and that can be direct or indirect. Blah, 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 shall be void or voidable solely for this reason, blah, 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 blah. If, then we have 3 alternatives. Okay, so 1, we have disclosure. I mentioned that. We'll talk about that in the Hayes case. And a board or committee of disinterested directors approves the transaction. That's 1. 2, the stockholders approve the transaction. That's 3. Or sorry, that the stockholder approvals 2. Or 3 is the contract is fair. So we have 2 procedural mechanisms for blessing a conflict of interest transaction: disinterested director approval or stockholder approval. And then we have a third, which says if the transaction is fair, then it's not void or voidable. Now, the book calls 144 and similar statutes safe harbor statutes, but it's not clear the extent to which they provide real safe harbors from judicial review. The basic problem is one of statutory interpretation. We're going to think this through in the cases. Assume we've got an interested transaction. It's fully adequately disclosed. We have 2 ways of reading 144A. Remember, the language of the statute says it's not void or voidable solely because it's an interested transaction, so long as one of those 3 conditions are met. So if you meet one of those conditions, what do you get? What have you achieved? Well, all you get is that it's not voidable. The corporation can't just walk away from it. Voidable doesn't mean it's immune from judicial scrutiny of the substantive terms. You still might have to determine it's fair, even if you proceed under subsection 1 or 2 of 144A. That is, all you get by satisfying subsection 1 or 2 under this literal reading is a very limited benefit of saying it is not a void or voidable contract. The more broader interpretation is this second one. And this interpretation would suggest if you satisfy one of those 3 conditions, then you get something more consequential. You can basically apply the business judgment rule. You avoid a fairness inquiry. We will act like this is not a conflict of interest transaction if you satisfy subsection 1 or 2 or 3, but the only way you get there through 3 is by demonstrating to a court that the terms are fair. The Delaware statute seems to suggest interpretation 1. Other statutes we'll see might be more ambiguous. In general, courts have typically followed interpretation number 1, resisting that broader reading of interpretation 2. That is, with interpretation 1, courts are preserving for themselves a fairness inquiry. If the benefits of complying with 144A are smaller, more limited, then there's still a role for the court in passing on the fairness of the terms. We'll think through how these provisions play out in a couple different cases.